The year is 1429. France is bleeding. For nearly a century, the kingdom has been torn apart by the 100 Years' War. English armies march across the countryside, burning villages, capturing cities, claiming a crown that is not theirs. The French king, Charles VII, hides in exile, his throne uncertain, his people despairing. The idea of a united France seems like a dream slipping away. But in the village of Domrémy, far from courts and armies, a teenage peasant girl listens to the wind. She is 17, uneducated, unknown, the daughter of farmers, and yet she claims to hear voices, not of men, but of saints. Voices that command her to do the impossible, to drive out the English, and to see Charles crowned king in the holy city of Reims. It is an idea so absurd, so impossible, that most would laugh. A girl in armor, leading soldiers, advising kings. No one would believe it. No one except Joan herself. What follows is one of the most extraordinary stories in human history. A story of faith against fear, of vision against doubt, of a young woman who stood before generals and priests and said with unshakable certainty, "I am sent by God." She would turn the tide of war, inspire armies, and give a dying kingdom new life. And yet her story would end in fire, betrayal, and martyrdom. This is the journey of Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orléans, a girl who rose from obscurity to become a legend, a saint, a warrior, a symbol for centuries to come. Chapter 1. A Kingdom in Crisis. The story of Joan of Arc begins not with her, but with a kingdom in pieces. France, in the early 15th century, was a land worn thin by war, suspicion, and despair. For nearly a century, its soil had been the battlefield of the 100 Years' War, a conflict that was less a single war than a chain of wars, truces, betrayals, and broken promises. The root of the struggle lay in a crown, the crown of France. Kings of England, descended from French royal bloodlines, claimed the right to sit upon the French throne. To the English, it was a matter of inheritance. To the French, it was an invasion. But to the common people, it was simply endless war. Soldiers trampling fields, fires consuming villages, hunger spreading like another army. By the time Joan was born in 1412, France was not the confident kingdom of Charlemagne or St. Louis. It was fractured, humiliated, and uncertain whether it would even survive. The north, including Paris itself, lay in the grip of English power. The Burgundians, a mighty French duchy, had sided with England, giving the invaders allies within the kingdom. Civil war and foreign occupation combined into a storm that few believed could be stopped. The rightful heir to the throne, Charles of Valois, held only a portion of the south. His enemies mocked him as the King of Bourges, for that was the limit of his true authority. He was a man alive, but a king half dead, shrouded in doubt. Even his allies whispered that he was illegitimate, not the true son of the late king. If the rumors were true, then his claim to France's throne was worth nothing. And if the king himself doubted, what hope could the people find? For the French peasantry, life had become a burden, carried in silence. Armies roamed like locusts. A harvest could be stolen by soldiers before it reached a barn. A field could be burned out of spite. A church bell might ring not for mass, but to warn of riders approaching. The rhythms of faith, planting, and trade, the very foundation of medieval life, were broken again and again. And worse still, the defeats of France were seen not only as political or military failures, but as spiritual ones. In the medieval mind, God chose winners and losers. If France was being beaten, perhaps it was because heaven had abandoned her. Each burned chapel, each lost battle, seemed to whisper that the Almighty had turned his face away. The great symbol of this despair was the Treaty of Troyes, signed in 1420. It declared that the English king, Henry V, would inherit the crown of France upon the death of Charles VI, bypassing Charles VII altogether. To many, it was nothing less than a betrayal of the kingdom's soul. The French crown itself had been promised to a foreign ruler. When Henry V died young, fate seemed to open a small door, but the English thrust it wider. They pressed their claim in the name of Henry's infant son, Henry VI, born of a French queen. An English child, barely learning to walk, was declared the rightful king of France. To those who remained loyal to Charles, this was humiliation beyond measure. The French people now lived under three shadows: the English occupation, the Burgundian betrayal, and the weakness of their own king. And yet history is full of strange balances. It is when despair grows deepest that the smallest light can seem like salvation. The French were desperate not only for soldiers or victories, but for a sign that heaven had not deserted them, a sign that the crown of France still held divine approval, a sign that God still walked with them in their suffering. That sign would come not from a royal court or a battlefield, but from a village so small that most maps ignored it. In Domrémy, far from Paris, far from courts and treaties, a girl tended sheep and prayed in her parish church. She was no queen, no noblewoman, no warrior. She was the daughter of farmers. She could not read or write. She was as ordinary as a pebble on a riverbank. But history has a way of lifting the ordinary into the extraordinary. In the silence of her fields, Joan began to hear something that no one else could. Voices, radiant and commanding, telling her that France would rise again, and that she, of all people, would be the one to lead her. France was broken. Its king was doubted. Its people were weary. Its enemies were strong. And yet, out of this wreckage, destiny was waiting for a girl who believed that God still spoke, and that his command could move armies, crown kings, and change the fate of nations. Chapter 2. The Voices. Domrémy was a quiet place, tucked in the Lorraine region of northeastern France. Surrounded by forests, fields, and streams, it seemed far removed from the flames of the 100 Years' War. Yet even there, the conflict was never far away. English raids sometimes swept through, and Burgundian soldiers were known to burn villages only a few miles distant. Joan's family, peasants like their neighbors, lived in this fragile balance of fear and faith. Joan of Arc was born in 1412, the youngest of 5 children. Her father, Jacques d'Arc, was a farmer of modest means. Her mother, Isabel, a deeply religious woman, taught Joan the prayers of the church. From her earliest days, Joan was known not for wildness or mischief, but for her piety. Neighbors would recall that she spent long hours in church, kneeling before statues, whispering prayers, her eyes closed in devotion. She did not know how to read or write. Few peasant children did, but she absorbed the stories of saints and martyrs told by priests and villagers alike. To Joan, faith was not a distant formality. It was the very air she breathed. It was around the age of 13 that something extraordinary happened. In later testimony, Joan described it simply: a great light accompanied by the voice of Saint Michael, the archangel. He was not alone. Soon she would also hear the voices of Saint Catherine of Alexandria and Saint Margaret of Antioch. These were not fleeting dreams. They returned again and again, speaking with authority and clarity. At first, the voices urged her to remain pure and devoted to God, but as the years passed, their commands grew bolder. They told her that she had been chosen for a divine mission, to drive the English from France and to see Charles VII crowned king in the Cathedral of Reims. It is difficult to imagine the weight of such words on a teenage girl. Joan was not a noblewoman with soldiers at her command. She was a peasant who had never held a sword, never ridden in battle, never stood before royalty. And yet she believed, absolutely without hesitation. To Joan, the voices were not suggestions. They were divine orders. Still, the command was not easy to obey. For years, she kept the visions secret, sharing them only with her confessor. But by 1428, when Joan was 16, the voices grew urgent. The English were pressing their advantage, and Charles's position was more desperate than ever. The voices told her the time had come to act. At first, her family resisted. When Joan told her cousin she must go to Charles, her father threatened to drown her rather than see her march off to war. But Joan was unmoved. She insisted she must obey God rather than man. In her certainty, she was unshakable. Her first attempt to reach the local commander was unsuccessful. She approached Robert de Baudricourt, captain of the garrison at Vaucouleurs, and told him plainly of her mission, that God had sent her to deliver France. Baudricourt laughed in her face. The idea of a teenage peasant girl leading armies was absurd. He dismissed her. But Joan did not give up. She returned months later, more insistent than ever, and this time she began to win hearts. The villagers of Vaucouleurs were struck by her sincerity, her confidence, and the purity of her reputation. This was no foolish dreamer. She seemed calm, steadfast, and strangely persuasive. She told Baudricourt again, "I must be at the Dauphin. My lord will have it so. There is no help but in him." By now, the desperation of France had grown so deep that even the impossible began to feel worth considering. Orléans, the last major stronghold on the Loire, was under siege. If it fell, France might fall with it. Baudricourt relented. He gave Joan an escort of soldiers to take her to Chinon, where Charles waited. The journey was perilous. Dressed in men's clothing to protect herself, Joan traveled over 300 miles through enemy territory, slipping past English patrols, crossing rivers, sleeping in barns and villages along the way. For 11 days she rode, a girl disguised as a soldier, claiming she bore a mission from heaven. When at last she arrived at Charles's court, skepticism awaited her. The Dauphin was unsure what to make of this peasant girl. Was she a prophetess, a fraud, a madwoman? To test her, Charles disguised himself as an ordinary courtier, while another noble took his place upon the throne. Joan entered the hall, ignored the false king, and walked straight to Charles, bowing before him and addressing him as the rightful heir. It was the first of many signs that left observers shaken. How had she known? Charles himself was unsettled, but he was also intrigued. In this girl, barefoot and unlearned, there was an aura of conviction, a fire that no courtly scholar could fake. Still, the church demanded proof. Joan was examined by theologians, questioned about her visions, her beliefs, her virginity. They searched for heresy, for contradiction, for signs of witchcraft. They found none. Instead, they found a young woman whose answers were simple, unwavering, and filled with the language of faith. And so, against all reason, Charles decided to trust her. A peasant girl from Domrémy was given armor, a horse, and a banner of white embroidered with the fleur-de-lis and the holy names of Jesus and Mary. She was not made a commander in title, but in spirit. She became something more, a living symbol that France was not abandoned, that God had not withdrawn his favor. The soldiers who mocked her soon found themselves inspired by her courage. To the weary armies of France, Joan was not just a girl in armor. She was hope, riding at their side. France had waited nearly a century, for a savior. And now, in the spring of 1429, she rode to Orléans. Chapter 3. The Warrior Saint. In the spring of 1429, the city of Orléans was dying. For months, English forces had encircled it, choking off supplies, hammering its walls, starving its people. If Orléans fell, the road into the heart of Charles's territory would lie open. Many believed it would be the death of France itself. And into this moment rode Joan, a girl of 17, clad in armor, carrying not a sword of legend, but a banner of white silk. On it, she had embroidered the names of Jesus and Mary, and the image of Christ, holding the world in his hand. It was not a weapon of steel, but a weapon of belief. The French commanders were cautious. To them, Joan was no soldier. She had never held command in war. But Charles had trusted her, and his army was in desperate need of inspiration. So she was given a place at Orléans, not as a general, but as a presence. And what a presence it became. From the moment she entered the city, the mood shifted. Crowds gathered in the streets, cheering, weeping, pressing to touch her banner or her horse. To the citizens, starved and weary, she was not a peasant girl. She was a messenger of heaven. Where despair had lived, hope now walked. Joan herself spoke with absolute certainty. She urged the soldiers to confess their sins, to pray, to cast off the language of defeat. She scolded them for swearing, for chasing women, for drunkenness, and somehow they listened. Hardened men-at-arms, who had ignored priests and nobles, bowed their heads when Joan commanded it. Then came the test of battle. The French had long hesitated, striking cautiously, fearful of English fortifications. But Joan urged boldness. She declared that God had sent her to break the siege. "Do not fear," she told them. "The Lord will deliver the city into our hands." On May 4th, 1429, the French launched their assault on the English stronghold at Saint-Lô. Joan rode with them, her banner lifted high. She did not swing a sword. That was not her mission. Instead, she stood where the fighting was fiercest, shouting encouragement, lifting her banner so all could see it waving above the smoke. The French soldiers surged, and by nightfall, the English position was taken. The very next day, they struck again, capturing another English bastion. The momentum was shifting. Soldiers who had once doubted now marched eagerly, saying only, "The Maid commands it." On May 7th came the decisive attack, the fortress of Les Tourelles, guarding the bridge into Orléans. The English had fortified it heavily, knowing it was the key to the siege. For hours the French charged, only to be beaten back. Arrows fell, stones crashed, men fell screaming into the river. At one point, Joan herself was struck by an arrow between the neck and shoulder. She staggered, wounded, blood pouring down her armor. The French faltered. For a moment, it seemed the attack would collapse. But then, to the astonishment of all, Joan returned. She pulled the arrow from her body, mounted her horse, and lifted her banner once more. Her voice rang out across the chaos. "In God's name, forward! Do not retreat!" The sight electrified the soldiers. With renewed fury, they surged again, scaling ladders, breaking defenses. By nightfall, Les Tourelles had fallen. The English fled across the river, leaving the siege broken. The city of Orléans erupted in joy. Bells rang, crowds filled the streets, priests led processions of thanksgiving. For months, they had waited for death, and now salvation had come, carried on the shoulders of a girl who claimed she was sent by God. News spread like wildfire. The Maid of Orléans was no longer a curiosity. She was a miracle. Her presence had not only broken a siege, but broken the paralysis of a nation. Soldiers who had slumped in defeat now marched with pride. Peasants who had despaired now whispered prayers of hope. Even nobles who had mocked her now rode at her side. Joan herself never claimed credit. She insisted the victory belonged to God alone. But everyone who saw her believed she was chosen. Still, her mission was not complete. The voices had not told her merely to win battles. They had commanded her to see Charles crowned king in the Cathedral of Reims. And so, without rest, she pressed for the next step. Many of Charles's advisors urged caution. They feared the English still held too much ground, that the road to Reims was long and dangerous. But Joan would not be moved. "Gentle Dauphin," she said, "hold no more counsels. March boldly, for it is God's will that you be crowned." In that conviction, she carried the kingdom itself. The Maid of Orléans was no longer just a peasant girl. She was now the beating heart of France, the banner under which a broken people could rise. Chapter 4. The Coronation. The victory at Orléans electrified France. For the first time in years, the English grip had been broken, and people whispered that perhaps God had not abandoned them after all. Yet Joan knew her task was unfinished. The voices had commanded her not merely to win battles, but to see Charles crowned at Reims. Without that sacred anointing, he was still a Dauphin, mocked, doubted, incomplete. The road to Reims cut through territory held by the English and their Burgundian allies. Charles's counselors urged caution. They begged him to wait, to negotiate, to avoid risking all on a dangerous march. But Joan would not bend. "Gentle Dauphin," she told him, Do not delay. The way is open. In God's name, go forward, for he has prepared the path." And so, in June 1429, the army moved. To the astonishment of all, towns opened their gates without resistance. At Troy, Joan urged an immediate assault, and the defenders surrendered rather than face her. At Chalons, citizens hailed her as a savior. It was as if her presence itself unshackled France, turning doubt into surrender and fear into loyalty. By July, the army reached Reims. The gates swung wide. The archbishop prepared the cathedral, and on July 17th, Charles knelt before the altar. Anointed with holy oil and crowned king, he rose as Charles VII of France. Trumpets sounded, bells rang, and the people cried out, "Long live the king!" Beside him stood Joan, her banner raised. She wept openly, declaring, "It was my banner that bore the toil. It is fitting it share the honor." To the crowd, she was not merely a girl in armor, she was a divine instrument, a living miracle. But even in triumph, cracks showed. Joan longed to march on Paris and complete the liberation. Charles, cautious and hesitant, began to withdraw into politics. For Joan, the coronation was the peak of her mission. For Charles, it was enough. Their paths, for the first time, began to diverge. Chapter 5. Betrayal and Capture. After Reims, Joan's star seemed unshakable, yet triumph quickly turned to frustration. She urged Charles to strike Paris, the heart of French humiliation, but his counselors counseled delay. In September 1429, she led an assault on the city walls, her banner lifted high. Arrows darkened the sky, ladders crashed, and men fell screaming. Joan herself was wounded by a crossbow bolt, yet she refused to retreat. Still, without reinforcements, the assault collapsed. Charles ordered a withdrawal. Paris remained in English hands. To Joan, the failure was not of faith, but of men. God had opened the door, but the king had hesitated. From that moment, her influence at court waned. Nobles who had once bowed to her now whispered that she was reckless, dangerous, even inconvenient. Charles turned increasingly to diplomats, seeking peace with Burgundy rather than trusting the boldness of war. Joan refused to fade into silence. In May 1430, she rode north to Compiègne, where Burgundian forces threatened the city. Leading a sortie, she charged at the head of her troops, fearless as ever. But the city gates closed too soon. Trapped outside, surrounded, Joan was pulled from her horse. Her captors jeered as they dragged her away, but she made no cry of fear. The Burgundians sold her to the English. For them, it was not enough to capture her. They needed to destroy her. Yet the cruelest wound was not her chains, but her abandonment. The king she had crowned, the Dauphin she had saved, made no move to ransom her. Charles, whose throne she had secured, let her fall into enemy hands. In the silence of her cell, Joan must have remembered the voices that warned she would suffer. Now she faced her trial, not in battle, but in betrayal. Chapter 6. Trial and Execution. The English feared Joan more than any army. They could defeat soldiers, but how to fight a girl who claimed heaven itself as her ally? Only one weapon remained, the courtroom. If they could brand her a heretic, her victories would be tainted, her banner turned to ash. In January 1431, Joan was brought to Rouen, placed in chains, and paraded before a tribunal of hostile clerics. They accused her of witchcraft, of sorcery, of pride. They mocked her voices as lies or demons. They demanded she submit to the church as her only authority, hoping to trap her into words they could twist. For weeks, she endured interrogation. Yet again and again, her answers confounded them. She, an uneducated peasant, displayed a wit and clarity that shamed her learned judges. When asked if she was in God's grace, she replied, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me. I should be the most miserable in the world if I knew I were not in His grace." It was an answer no theologian could condemn, but the verdict was predetermined. They condemned her for wearing men's clothing, a necessity in prison to protect herself. They condemned her voices as false. On May 30th, 1431, Joan was led into Rouen marketplace, bound to a wooden stake. As the flames rose, she cried the name of Jesus again and again. Witnesses said her last word was His name. Even hardened English soldiers wept. One turned to his comrades and said, "We are lost. We have burned a saint." When the fire consumed her body, the executioners scattered her ashes in the Seine, fearing that relics of the maid might become holy. Joan had died at 19, but death only magnified her. Chapter 7. Legacy. Joan's enemies thought fire would silence her. Instead, it gave birth to legend. Within decades, her name was whispered as martyr, not heretic. In 1456, a retrial called by the Pope declared her innocent, nullifying the charges that condemned her. Her judges were disgraced, her memory restored. But Joan had already become something larger than any verdict. To the French, she was not merely a warrior, but a miracle, proof that God could lift the humblest peasant to confound kings and armies. Soldiers carried her memory into future battles. Priests invoked her name in sermons. She became the soul of a nation, struggling to rise from its ashes. Across centuries, her figure has inspired artists, generals, revolutionaries, and believers. In 1920, the Catholic Church canonized her as Saint Joan of Arc, giving divine recognition to what people had long believed, that she was chosen. Today, statues of Joan stand in cathedrals and town squares. Her banner still waves in memory, not of steel or conquest, but of faith and courage. She lived only 19 years, but in that brief span, she altered the destiny of France and left a legacy that belongs to the world. History is filled with kings, emperors, and generals, yet it was a teenage girl from a forgotten village who carried a kingdom on her shoulders. Joan of Arc did not fight for power or glory. She fought because she believed. She believed that God still spoke, that France could rise, that one voice, certain and unshaken, could change the course of nations. She crowned a king, lifted a people, and died in flames. But the fire meant to silence her became a beacon. Centuries later, her name still stirs hearts, not as a tale of defeat, but as a triumph of spirit. Joan reminds us that greatness does not come from birth or title, but from conviction, that even the humblest life if guided by purpose, can echo through eternity. She was the Maid of Orléans. She was Saint Joan of Arc, and her story will never burn away.